Okay, welcome everyone to today's presentation titled Get Your Mind in the Gutter, which I cannot take credit for this fun title. I really wanted to teach about stormwater, which is not an exciting topic if you were to scroll across that. And I asked some of my graduates of my Florida Water Stewardship program that I teach in the fall every year for some ideas for titles, and this was one of them. So with that, I know people will continue to kind of trickle in with the ease and access of online virtual programming, but I want to respect your time for being on time. So we are going to go ahead and dive in to today's presentation. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Lara Milligan. I am the Natural Resources Agent for UF IFAS Extension, Pinellas County. My office is stationed up at Burker Creek Preserve in Tarpon Springs. I'm very fortunate for that. And just a little insight into my background in education. So I am a Florida native, which I know is a rarity. I grew up actually on the southeast coast of Florida. And what kind of sparked my interest in environmental anything was I participated in what's called the Jupiter Environmental Research and Field Studies Academy. It was a 4-year program in high school, and that's really what set me on the path to where I am today. I then went on to University of Florida, kind of dabbled around in a few different majors from wildlife ecology, and ultimately ended up getting a degree in natural resource conservation, and then a master's in forest resources and conservation. During my master's, I got a certificate in environmental education and communication. So that was really my focus of my teaching during that time. And then I am also a graduate of the Florida Natural Resources Leadership Institute, which I highly, highly recommend to anyone who's interested, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about that. So my contact information is at the end. So what to expect for today's presentation. So I want you to buckle your seatbelt because we're going to start kind of big picture with water to set the stage for talking about stormwater, because you really can't just jump right in. You really need to understand the big picture. So we're going to spend some time there. Then we'll get to the smaller picture and focus in on stormwater. And of course, we always like to wrap up with what you can do. And do stay with me because I'm battling a little bit of a cold, so I might pause for water or just mute to clear my throat from time to time. So apologies in advance for that. Okay, so first I just wanted to set the stage. I know I said we're going to start big picture, but just so you know what we're talking about when I say stormwater. Stormwater is rainwater, which I don't know where you're at right now, but it's raining here. I had that planned out. So stormwater is rainwater that runs off streets, lawns, and other sites. So basically, once the rainwater hits the ground and then runs across that surface, at that point we call that stormwater. Some people use the terms interchange runoff and stormwater. Some people put them together and say stormwater runoff. So any combination of those words is more or less talking about the same thing. And we'll talk more about that later. So you might be like, well, why stormwater? And I'm very grateful that you're even here to learn about this topic. So it's because it's a big deal. That's why I wanted to talk about it. It's actually considered one of the greatest threats to clean waters in the United States. This isn't just a Pinellas County issue. It's not just a Florida issue. This is throughout the United States, a big problem that we are tackling. I was also recently awarded a Tampa Bay Estuary Program mini grant, which is funded through the sale of their specialty license plates. And as part of that funding, I'm going to be piloting a program called Adopt a Drain, referring to storm drains, and doing outreach on stormwater. So this is kind of the kickstart to that. And then because, right, we care, it's our job in extension we care about this. We don't want this threat to our waters, and the way that we can best battle that is to educate and take action kind of at the grassroots level. Okay, so for the big picture idea, something that we often talk about when we're referring to water, at least in extension, or for me, we talk about this idea or concept of a water story. And so anytime you see water, whether it's rainwater or something coming out of a pipe or water in your home, we want to ask ourselves, what's the water story here? And then what is my place in the water story? How am I impacting, affecting, either positively or negatively, this source of water? And kind of diving in a little bit deeper, the more localized, smaller picture of the water story is we want to develop this eye for water. So taking that a step further, so what's the water story here? But really, okay, this water's coming out of my tap, that's great, right? Would be another story if it was not. But where is that water coming from? And maybe you know that answer and maybe you don't. So that could be your homework if you don't know the answer. And then once that water goes down the drain in your sink, do we know where that water goes? Again, maybe you know the answer, maybe you don't. Maybe that's some homework for you. And you can do this anywhere you go on your daily journey to and from work or to and from school. So you can do right here is a storm drain. So, okay, the water, right, we see it going down the drain, but do we know where that's going? And so here's some examples, and I do want to keep this interactive, so I will encourage you guys to use the chat feature on your screen. You should see on the bottom, there's an option to open the chat and you can type in a response there. And certainly as you guys have questions throughout the program, you can use the Q&A feature and type your question there, and I'll answer those at the very end. So can anyone tell me what the water story is with this top right picture here? Anything you want to share or say about water as it relates to this image? And I'll give you a second to open your chat and type in a response. Okay, so question, yeah, so hydroponics, question mark, is it reclaimed? Is it a way to conserve water? All excellent questions. So yes, this is considered a form of hydroponics, which is one tool or technique that can save a significant amount of water when it comes to growing all sorts of different crops. And you can do the same thing again, anywhere we go. We could say, okay, what's the water story here? And there's so many different stories that you could come up with this one image. So for me, the first thing I saw was, okay, well, I can see this part right here. That's the water line. So at some point, the water level was up this much higher than it currently is. And again, you could be like, well, is that a spring there? Is it just a swamp? So many questions. And that's what we want to encourage you guys to start thinking about, especially when it comes to stormwater. And then again, big picture, we want to remember with water, everything is connected to everything else and everything goes somewhere. Okay, so generally speaking, in Florida, we can find water above ground and below ground. When we're talking about water that's above the ground, we refer to that as surface water. Maybe you've heard that term. If not, I might be referencing it again in the next couple slides. So surface water, I'm talking about water that we see above ground. If you see it, it's pretty much considered surface water. And then beneath our feet right now, there's what we call groundwater. So that's anything again below the ground. And we'll talk a little bit more about these. So one type of surface water are rivers and streams. So we aren't really known for our rivers here in Pinellas County, but we have lots of rivers in the state. We have 12 major rivers and then over 10,000 miles of both major rivers and smaller tributaries and rivers throughout the state. There's also lakes and ponds, right? And we have, again, not as many lakes here in Pinellas County. If you've ever heard of Lakeland, Florida, there's a reason it has its name. We do have lots of ponds and lots of stormwater ponds as well. But in the state overall, there's about 7,800 lakes. We also have a really unique type of lake called called coastal dune lakes. Sorry, they are rare. They're called coastal dune lakes. And these are lakes that are so close to the coast that the water actually interchanges underground. There's some tidal influence with the ocean because of its proximity to the salt water. So it's a really, really unique feature. There's more of those in like northeast Florida. And then we have, of course, wetlands, right? We have a very famous wetland in Florida. Feel free to type that in the chat if you know that. I'll have some actual pop quizzes throughout. So we have freshwater and saltwater wetlands, which also make up a big portion of surface water in the state. And right, so Florida, we're a peninsula, we're surrounded by oceans, which are another type of surface water. We also have estuaries where basically things like rivers would meet the ocean. And then in Pinellas County, we're unique because we're that little peninsula off of a larger peninsula. So water is a critical, critical natural resource for us in the state, but also here in Pinellas County. But despite what we see, and we do see a lot of water above ground, most of Florida's water is actually beneath our feet. And when it's beneath our feet, we refer to that kind of holding tank of water beneath our feet as an aquifer. And if you were to look up a definition of aquifer, it would be something along these lines. So it's a body of rock or sediment or a combination of the two that holds groundwater. Not a lot of people ever get the chance to see the aquifer. Some cave divers, if you're that brave, get a chance to explore that. That will never be me. I will enjoy their amazing photography, but it's an amazing, amazing resource that we have that's right beneath our feet, like literally as we're talking right now. Now, when we talk about aquifers, there's actually different levels or layers of aquifers in the state. So this image here shows the top being like the most shallow, getting to the deepest level of the aquifer. So this kind of, I don't know, tannish pink, almost like salmon color at the top. This is what we call the superficial aquifer system. So superficial, closest to the surface, you can think about it like that. And you can see Pinellas County, does not underlie Pinellas County. There's actually a unique little feature, also relatively shallow, called the Biscayne Aquifer in Southeast Florida. Then there's this small, if you go a little bit deeper, there's this intermediate aquifer system that makes up a small chunk of Southwest Florida. And then once you go even deeper, you can see the Flora Dan Aquifer just covers the entire state, goes into Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama. So this massive, massive system, again, underlying the whole state. So you could probably see how that is where the majority of our water is found. So I kind of just gave it away, so we'll see if you were paying attention, but do you guys know the name of the aquifer then that underlies us here in Pinellas County? I know some of you might not be joining from Pinellas County, but either way, this would be applicable to you. So let's see, open the chat. Oh, look at that, Regina is on it. Yeah, so it's called the Flora Dan. So it kind of takes out, we might refer to people as Floridians, but kind of take out that second I at the end, and it's the Flora Dan Aquifer. So if you ever get quizzed on that, now you will know. And yes, I see some of you, I didn't have the chat open before. So yeah, the Florida Everglades is definitely our main wetland that we are known for and is a critical, critical natural resource for the state. So when we talk about the aquifer, I think for most of us, and we're going to talk about the water cycle, right? We always learned this water cycle as this beautiful circle and water falls and it seeps into the ground. And you might have heard of people saying like, it'll recharge the aquifer. And that can be true, but not in all parts of the state. So there's different, what we would call confining layers underneath our feet, which is basically just a layer of clay. So there's different kind of elements within the soil. And where there's a thick clay layer, that water actually can't permeate down into the Florida Aquifer to recharge it. So just because water does seep into the soil doesn't always necessarily mean that it's going to recharge the aquifer. So you might have heard from time to time, so you can kind of see on the right-hand side of the screen, some people will refer to recharge areas. So this is something that land managers and water resource managers want to pay attention to, because if we know there's a recharge area somewhere where that water can recharge our aquifer, we probably want to try not to develop that area or do whatever we can to encourage that water to have time to seep into the soil and recharge our aquifer. And we'll talk about why that's important in a second. So this is a statistic for the entire state, but 95% of the water that we use within our household comes from groundwater. So again, a critical resource and very important for us to protect our aquifers and the waters going into it. Now here in kind of the Tampa Bay area and Pinellas County, we're a little unique in that, so again, that 95% was for the whole state. But this here, again, this is from March 2021. So Tampa Bay Water is a regional water supplier. The majority of us get our water from Tampa Bay Water. This doesn't apply to everyone, so this is just kind of the best way that I could make a statement that's applicable to most people. But on their website, every month they update water sources and where we're getting our water from. So right now, we're only pulling about 60% of our water from the aquifer. And then our desalination plant is operational. And so we're getting about 8% of our water from that. And then almost, well, actually 31% from surface water, which when Tampa Bay Water refers to surface water, they're pulling from the Hillsborough River, the Alafaya River, and then there's some other reservoirs that we pull from as well. None of which are in Pinellas County. So that's another story for another day. But Tampa Bay Water, if you have never been to their website, they have really, really great educational resources to help connect you and better understand where our water is coming from. And then of course, right, water's dynamic. It's not always staying in a lake or pond, it's moving laterally, it's moving up and down. And so when we think about how that happens, one way is through springs. And springs are one way that groundwater, right, we can't see it, becomes surface water. And in Florida, this is another big attraction for tourists, is we have over 700 freshwater springs and more magnitude springs than any other state. So it's a big draw and a critical resource that a lot of people are fighting to protect. And something I honestly didn't know until a few years ago is that there's actually something called a swallet or swallet, depending on how you pronounce it, where surface water will disappear underground to become groundwater. So this is a really cool kind of long exposure image where you can see the water swirling and this water is disappearing underground into a sinkhole. Okay, and again, thinking big picture with this idea of how water's moving up and down. We have surface water, we have groundwater, we have them going one way or the other. And then we add in this idea of a watershed, which maybe you've heard this term, maybe you haven't. There's all different definitions, but basically it's an area of land that collects water that drains into some other common body of water. And you can see here, this is outlining a large watershed. So some of the water might go into this lake, might go into the stream. And obviously, like I said before, everything's connected to everything else. So it will ultimately flow out into the coast, into the ocean. But it's an important concept because even what you're doing way up here can impact the water all the way down here. And the same is true underneath our ground. So there's actually something called a spring shed, which is the same kind of idea. So it's the area of land, but this would be underground that's contributing to the flow or discharge of a spring. And that can come from both surface water and groundwater. And as you can imagine, this is not an easy thing to map or figure out where spring sheds are in the state. There are efforts underway. There are some spring sheds mapped out, but definitely not the whole state. This is a newer kind of development in the water resources management world. Okay, y'all still with me? You can give me a thumbs up, a yes in the chat, because we are going to get into stormwater, I promise. I'm still setting the stage. All right, Carolyn's with me, Ann's with me. Yay, Gina loves springs. Who doesn't love springs? Especially in the hot summer months. All right. Okay, so now we're going to talk rain, which again, it's like so ironic because it's raining right now. So I went back just to look at statistics for 2020, and for Pinellas County specifically, we received 49 inches of rain, and 32 inches of that happened during our rainy season. So like our summer months, a little bit into fall. So we often hear, how much rain the state of Florida gets, like anywhere from 50 to 60 inches of rain, depending where you are. But the important thing to remember is that that rain is not equally spread throughout the year, right? There's certain months of the year where we're getting a lot more rain. And that's why things like the fertilizer ordinance, which I'll mention towards the end, that's only applicable during the summer months because of the rain. And again, we can talk more details. And I hope you can hear me over the rain. It's getting quite loud here. So when we talk density, and I guess, Julia, feel free to unmute if you can't hear me through the rain. For Pinellas County, if you didn't know, I say this statistic all the time because I think it's a really critical statistic to know, especially as it relates to our natural resources. So we are the most densely populated county in the state. We are not a very large county, but we have a lot of people. And that does not come without its consequences as it relates to our natural resources. So ignore these stars on the right. I couldn't get them to go away from my Google Maps. And try and focus on the bigger picture of what I'm going to tell you here. So this image on your left is a satellite aerial image of, this is, well, it used to be called Lake Butler, but this is Lake Tarpon in northern Pinellas County. Back in 1926. At that time, the population was 28,000, which is like really hard for me to say and make sure that I'm saying it correct because it's very mind-blowing. And you compare that to, so this is again just a screenshot from Google Maps of the exact same area in 2021. There's lots of things that we can note that have changed aside from the name of the lake changing. Right, you can very clearly see where I work. Brooker Creek Preserve is now outlined by, excuse me, by development. You can't really tell here, but there's now an outfall canal coming out of Lake Tarpon that we made that goes and leads into Upper Tampa Bay. And then look at our estimated population. Like we're almost at a million people from 28,000. Again, this is a, almost close to 100 years, but that's a big change. And that change, again, does not come without consequences to our natural resources and specifically our water resources. So I'd be curious if anyone is willing to share, take a guess at how those changes that you just saw on your screen might impact the water cycle. All right, let's see, more being removed from groundwater, then is replaced by rain, more water differently. Wow, they're all coming in so fast, they can't keep up. Using up water, more polluted runoff, less absorption of rainfall. Yes, yes, you guys are good. Yeah, and we're gonna explore these more. So again, I've mentioned the water cycle before. And this is usually some version of what we'll see when we see the water cycle, right? It's this beautiful open green space, natural area where water can land on green space and infiltrate and percolate into the soil and, you know, do this beautiful water cycle. But when we add development, like if this was to be Pinellas County, this would look very different. And so there's been a lot of research done on the impacts and looking at what we now call the urban water cycle. And what I want to show you here, so on the left would be like rain right now here. I'm at Brooker Creek Preserve, so it's in a nice natural area. There's no development or anything here. When it rains, right, almost 50% of that is going to infiltrate into the soil to some degree. About 10% will run across the land, right? The soil's been saturated, it's going to run across the land, hopefully go into Brooker Creek, which flows into Lake Tarpon. And then with all our plants and trees, right, we have this evapotranspiration, the plants are taking this up. They're kind of sweating out the water in the form of water vapor. Then we go, okay, yeah, let's go to downtown Clearwater, right? Lots of development, especially right downtown Clearwater, there's like no trees. And we look at the same concept of the water cycle. It rains, it has nowhere to go to infiltrate into the soil because it's all pavement. We refer to that as impervious surfaces. So you'll see only about 15% of that water will be able to find a place to infiltrate into the soil. And then you can see this number from 10 in a natural area up to 55% of that water is now hitting the pavement and running off to somewhere, which again, we'll talk about in a little bit, but this is where the idea of stormwater comes from, stormwater runoff. And this is where there's call for concern. Okay, so you've made it. We're now diving into this idea or concept of stormwater, kind of focusing in on this picture or image here. So again, as a reminder, stormwater is just a fancy way of saying rainwater that is running along all sorts of developed surfaces or really any surface, but it's not really infiltrating into the soil is what we want to emphasize there. So this is a really good graphic that highlights, I guess, potential causes for concern as it relates to stormwater and rainwater. So, right, rainwater is probably hitting your roof right now, like it is here, flowing then into your driveway, maybe where your car is sitting there. Perhaps it's leaked a couple, who knows what, out of, you know, your air conditioner. Perhaps you just fertilize the plants in your yard. You just let your dog out to do its business. And that water is picking up all of that along the way. And again, flowing ultimately to a storm drain, which you can probably see somewhere in your yard or neighborhood. So it's picking up, again, all of these different potential pollutants. And we will talk more about these in a second. So with stormwater, the reason that it's such an issue is it can cause so many different problems. So number one, it can cause flooding, because if we think back to that graphic before where I showed the natural kind of water cycle and the urban water cycle, that water, right, is now, it's not infiltrating into the soil. So we're having all of this water and then it needs to go somewhere, right? And so we're sending it somewhere, but it's reaching that point at a very, the water's flowing at a faster rate and in a much larger quantity or volume than it would in a natural setting. As a result of that, the water, again, is flowing much faster. So there's going to be significantly more issues when it comes to erosion. Erosion can lead to this concept or idea of turbidity. So if we think about water flowing along, let's just say a street, you know, there's always different sediments and soils and sands that have accumulated on the street. That gets picked up and will flow into whatever body of water that storm drain is emptying into. And while we might think like, oh, well, sand and dirt is natural, it's not natural when it collects, again, at that velocity and that quantity and then dumps into a body of water. And the sediments can be basically dispersed in the water column enough to the point where they are limiting the amount of sunlight that can penetrate into the water, which impacts the whole system, really, from the submerged aquatic vegetation to the animals that feed on that vegetation, and so on and so forth. Of course, if we remember back to that image I just showed you with the fertilizer and the dog poop and the car oil, right? That water is now contaminated. And something that I don't want to jinx us, but we haven't heard about so much lately is, if you remember a few years ago when we were getting a ton of rain from different storm events, there was a lot of dumping of partially treated sewage. And so there's like this weird connection. It's like, okay, well, how, if it's raining more, like, why are we having to dump sewage water? And I wrote a whole blog about it, but we all have a direct connection to this sewage overflow that we can hopefully help prevent. We all have, if you're a homeowner, somewhere in your yard, there's what we call a yard clean out. It's a little cap. Usually it's like, looks like a little white PVC pipe. Sometimes they're green. And you want to make sure that that lid is on that clean out, because otherwise that is leading directly into the stormwater system that's not, I'm sorry, into the sewage system that is not designed to, right? That's only designed to treat wastewater, not stormwater. And so that system gets very much overwhelmed by that. So that's a super easy thing you guys can all check in your yard. If you don't know where yours is, that could be a fun adventure. Then if you do find it, just make sure that cap is on there correctly. And then I mentioned this idea of erosion, but when we think about it in kind of natural system, it can cause streams or creeks. So think Brooker Creek here, the stream to widen, which again would not be happening normally when that water is slowly, there's less runoff. But in an urban setting, that water is again coming at a faster rate and at a much larger quantity and volume. So it can make the streams widen, which can then cause additional erosion problems, which we call down cutting. We don't have to get into that. I've already talked about the volume and velocity. Something I thought was really interesting as I was doing additional research on stormwater and different impacts was they've actually documented that there's the stormwater temperature, that the water of the storm, sorry, the temperature of the stormwater can actually increase because as it's running across this very, very hot pavement, right, that water is going to heat up. And by the time it ends up in whatever its final destination is, that can impact the overall temperature of that water body, which can then again impact the different aquatic life that's found there. There's heavy metal bioaccumulation that we have to consider as well. And there's all different pollutants that water again will pick up along the way, where heavy metals will be picked up, and excess nutrients can also be picked up along the way through a variety of sources, which again we'll talk about in a minute, but that can reduce the amount of dissolved oxygen in the final destination of the stormwater, which can ultimately lead to fish kills. So again, I was looking back at all different research, and it's kind of fun to look back at the history of stormwater. And there's a report from the Environmental Protection Agency back in 1996 that indicated that urban runoff was the leading source of pollutants. So this is not a new issue. I guess in the big picture, right, it might be new, but we have been battling this stormwater pollution issue for some time. So I mentioned that the water can pick up different pollutants, and I've touched on some of these already, but I wanted to highlight a few that I haven't. So one is car washing. So when you guys wash your cars, we encourage you to actually wash your car on your yard or any like grassy area instead of washing it on the pavement, because that again gives water time to filter through the soil and hopefully the plants to pick up some of those chemicals before they, you know, as opposed to it just reaching the storm drain and directly entering a body of water. Pool water, same thing. And I'll talk about these more when we get into things we can do. Pressure washing is another source of chemicals. Any pesticides, fertilizers are included down here under nutrients. I've talked about these other ones. So I think having nutrients on this slide can be a little confusing to people, right? It's like, how are nutrients a pollutant? I thought nutrients were a good thing, and they are in the right amount. But when we have excess nutrients, that's when it's a bad thing. And a lot of the activities that we do can contribute to excess nutrients that wouldn't be there naturally or wouldn't be there normally. So leaf litter, so right when we're raking our leaves and things like that, we want to collect that. We don't want that to enter the storm system because that's just another source of nutrients. The same goes with grass clippings. So when we mow our yard, we want to keep those grass clippings in the yard because once they enter the storm drain, right, that's going to be, again, another source of nutrients that wouldn't and shouldn't be there in a natural setting. So I mentioned before, those excess nutrients can lead to, right, the algae are like, oh, yay, nutrients. And so they will kind of explode, and we have these algae blooms, which through the process will use up a lot of oxygen, which can ultimately lead to fish kills. And in general, we can have poor water quality from the many things that I have mentioned before. So this image here shows, I know there's a lot here, so I'm going to try and walk us through it. This solid line is looking at pre-development. The dotted line is looking at post-development. So you can think like natural area, urban area. And then we're looking strictly at storm events. So this is highlighting what I said before. So in a natural area, right, we get a large storm event, there's a lot of rain. That water is slowly, kind of the level of the water in whatever body of water is going to slowly increase as the runoff makes its way there. And then, oops, sorry. You know, it's going to gradually recede as evaporation happens. And it's kind of this nice flow, nothing abrupt. And then when we have an urban setting where there's lots of development, lots of impervious surfaces, right? There's a large storm event. That quantity of water, again, has nowhere to go. So it's going to all collect and go into one water body. And that is going to increase that kind of level of water significantly, very, very fast. And then, right, that water has to go somewhere. So it's either going to flood and go elsewhere, or there'll be another kind of outfall drainage system that allows that water to then leave the system very, very quickly. And then that can lead to other issues that we have talked about before. And then this is just showing a smaller storm event, and it's the same concept. It's just this very abrupt change, which is not natural and is not good for our ecosystems or the plants and animals in them. All right, so I think this might be my last pop quiz. It's true or false, so you got 50-50 chance of getting it right. Stormwater is treated through the same process and system as wastewater. Correct. You guys are good. Yes. False, false, nope, and no, no, no. So we have separate systems to treat the wastewater. So things from when we wash our clothes, when we use the restroom, when we take a bath or a shower or wash our hands, that water leaves your house through something called a private lateral, which you all own. We won't get into that today either. And it goes straight into the sanitary sewer system, which will flow to a wastewater treatment facility where the water is treated. And then there's a whole separate system for when it rains, we collect that water through usually some form of a storm drain, or some people refer to this as a catch basin. The water will collect there, and then it flows directly into a stormwater system, which is again just another series of pipes, but that flows directly into some nearby body of water. There's no formal treatment process with that water. So the county, as you can imagine, when I talk about pipes, we have a lot of pipes. We have a big, massive stormwater system that's really designed to manage that runoff from rainfall. So they are in high effect right now during the rain. Their main goal really is to reduce flooding. So if that water, if we did not have these storm drains and stormwater systems, right, we would just be flooded all the time. So the goal was like, get this water away. And of course, right, we're learning from, that was the best available option at the time that we thought made the most sense. And now we're learning maybe that's not the best process. So we are trying to now focus on mimicking natural processes, which I'll talk about some things that you guys can do in your own yard to do that, and ultimately help to filter out pollutants before they reach their final destination. I mentioned, I'm not going to go like super in depth. This is the only slide that has a timeline if any of you guys are like, I hate history. But so 1972 is when the Clean Water Act was passed. Within the Clean Water Act, there's something called the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, which I don't expect you to remember any aspect of that. But the thing is, it wasn't really until 1972 that we even decided like, oh, maybe we should start to regulate like we're dumping into our water bodies, both in the form of wastewater and stormwater. It wasn't until 1979 that there was a big study that looked at urban runoff. We weren't so much focused on this idea of stormwater until after this study. We're like, oh, it's rainwater, it's got to be fine. So it wasn't until then, 1987, that the Clean Water Act was amended, and there was now like strict regulations as it relates to stormwater. And we refer to that as permitting. And again, we won't go super in depth on that, but just so you guys know, the county does a lot to help manage our stormwater through these permits. So one of the requirements that they have to do is public education and outreach, and I'll highlight a few opportunities for that, one of which I'm doing now. They have something called illicit discharge detection and elimination, which is a fancy way of saying preventing people from dumping stuff down the storm drains that should not be dumped down the storm drains. Public involvement and participation, so that's in the form of like public meetings and volunteering for different events. There's all sorts of different pollution prevention methods, which we don't have time to get into today. Lots of efforts around construction sites and controlling runoff with those. And then same with after construction and any type of development or redevelopment, those all have to be managed very, very particularly under these permits. And so I mentioned the county's doing a lot. And so some of the things coming up, there is something called Lakes and Ponds Day, which the county does every year. It's coming up on May 22nd. I hope I have that date right in my brain. And I'm going to be sharing a bunch of links with you guys after this. They put out door hangers, bill inserts, they do storm drain marking. So you might, if you have a storm drain near you, it might say like drains to pond or drains to lake on there. If you don't have a storm drain marker, you can reach out to the county and we can help get your storm drain marked. They do all sorts of cleaning and restoring of ditches that help to funnel that stormwater to appropriate locations. So I know I've been seeing them out and about doing a lot of work in preparation for the rainy season. They help to stabilize banks to prevent erosion, lots of maintenance around stormwater ponds. And I also wrote a whole blog about this, but we have really old pipes in Pinellas County And so slowly the county is doing retrofits and replacing old metal pipes with concrete pipes. There's different types of enforcement to help protect stormwater or just really water quality in general. So there's the fertilizer ordinance I mentioned before, and then there's efforts to prevent and report illegal dumping. So I'll include, there is a email that you guys can use to report any illegal dumping if you see that when you are out and about. And then they also do data collection, which you've probably heard a lot about with the Piney Point incident that the county is also involved with, but they do a variety of data collection to help guide their efforts with managing our local water resources. All right, so I like talking about this part as it relates to stormwater because I feel like a lot of the things that we can do to help with stormwater are really what I would call like low-hanging fruit. They're easy things that we can do. And it starts, so first thing is fertilize correctly. And I don't know, that might sound silly. You just wanna make sure that you read the label, do your research. We have tons of great resources through our Florida-friendly landscaping program to help you guys with this. And you definitely wanna be a weather watcher, right? Like if you fertilized your yard this morning, maybe not a good idea because you knew it was gonna rain. So we definitely wanna make sure that we're not fertilizing right before we know it's gonna rain, because then that fertilizer is just gonna run off into the stormwater. Picking up after your pet is something that we really need to stress. We have a lot of pets, especially dogs in Pinellas County. And if you were to do the math about like how much poop that would be every day if we didn't pick up after our pets, that's a lot of excess nutrients that again is not part of the natural system. It should not be there. It's not considered a fertilizer. So we really need to be sure to pick up after our pets, not only for the sake of our water quality, but for the sake of the bottom soles of our shoes, right? It's like the worst way to start or end your day. Picking up litter, that helps in so many ways. I do a whole program on microplastics, so we won't get into that, but that's a very simple thing that we can do. I mentioned this already before, washing your car in the grass. Again, it kind of seems like, why do we want to put those chemicals on the grass? But you got to just think about the alternative, which is it just flowing directly into a nearby body of water without the opportunity to get filtered out or taken up by plants. Keeping your grass clippings in your yard, I mentioned that. Draining your pool. There's so many of these things that I remember growing up that my dad did inappropriately because he just did not know. Like, we definitely used to drain our pool directly into the storm drain, and that is 100% what we do not want to do. Again, you want to drain it into your yard to give that water a chance to infiltrate and soak into the soil. And I like this concept is, right, like, don't let your runoff run off. The rainwater that comes off, the rainwater you collect on your yard, if you want to do everything you can to help keep that water in your yard if possible. So again, that allows it to soak into the soil and be filtered. It can help potentially replenish our aquifer if you are in a recharge area, and slows the flow of the water as well. And there's just a few quick tips and ways that you guys can do this. This one's like the easiest thing ever. If you do have a rain gutter and your rain gutter is directed onto your driveway, turn it into your yard. So that's super simple. We want to direct that water again into an area where the water has time to seep into the soil. There's all different things you can add or attach to the base of your gutter, or you could consider installing rain gutters if you don't have any. If you have an area in your yard where you know water tends to collect, you could consider building what we call a rain garden, which is essentially just a depression area in your yard that you design with a little bit of certain substrate. Again, that's a whole different program. And you plant with plants that can tolerate periods of really wet and periods of really dry, and again, gives the water a chance to stay there and not run off. And any vegetation that you plant in your yard is not only good for our water resources, helping to slow the flow of water, but it's really beneficial for our local wildlife as well. So I mentioned before that you can report violations if you see somebody dumping something illegally into the storm drain. Literally the only thing that should go down a storm drain is rainwater. Nothing else is okay to go down a storm drain. So you can send an email to watershed@pinellascounty.org, and they will send somebody out to check on that. The fact that you're here now, right? You can check this box. You have educated yourself, but I am one person. I mentioned before, we have close to 1 million people in Pinellas County. So if you share like one little nugget of what you learned today, which is hopefully you have something to take with you, right? You can help me help other people, and ultimately, again, our water. We as Extension offer a variety of programs. We're actually in the middle of what we call Earth Week. So we have a number of different programs, one every day this week that you can check out. I'll include that link in the follow-up email if you want to see what's coming up. And there's so many opportunities for you to get involved. These are just a few. They're kind of in the background here. So I mentioned every fall I offer a Florida Water Stewardship Program where we learn all about water at the state and local level. So it's like this, but on steroids, and we do field trips and all sorts of fun things. I will be piloting an Adopt a Storm Drain program soon. We're having some issues with, anyway, it's government, but we'll get there. And but basically you'll get to pick a storm drain in your yard or neighborhood and just help to keep it clear and free to allow it to function as it should. The county's doing a really cool flip program where you can basically get funding to convert your yard from traditional turf grass to more Florida-friendly landscaping. And the county also offers an adoptive pond program, which is strictly for unincorporated Pinellas County. But if you have a pond in your yard, you can reach out to the Adopt a Pond program coordinator and see if your pond qualifies. And that could definitely be a way for you to get involved. And again, this is just like scratching the surface of opportunities for you. So I just want to stress again and have you kind of remember and wrap up with this idea of the water story. And as you go about your day, of course, like it stops raining right as I'm about to wrap up. You want to ask yourself, right, what is the water story here? And then what is your role in the water story? And if you want to venture this far, I talked about this idea or concept of watersheds. There's a really cool map online where you can see, if you're in Pinellas County, they outline the different watersheds and you can see which one that you live in. And that will just help to give you a little bit more of a connection with your local water resources. So for example, I live in the Bishop Creek watershed, which, you know, I'm not from Pinellas County, so I moved here. I'm like, I don't know anything about Bishop Creek. So it's like, oh, okay, well, where's Bishop Creek and where does Bishop Creek flow into? So it's just a great way, again, to get connected with your local water resources and understand where your water goes. So with that, I've been talking for way too long, and I will now, Julia is going to launch a quick poll if you guys wouldn't mind answering that, and then we will jump into some Q&A. So if you guys have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, so you can click on that on your screen, and then it should give you an option to type in a question. Okay, I see Julia closed the poll. So, okay, we have our first question from Colin. Do they qualify as brackish? Oh gosh, I don't know what you're referring to as they. Do they qualify as brackish, or is the saline fresh interchange purely underground? Colin, if you can type at what were you referring to as they? Oh, Okay. Yeah, you can clarify that either in the chat or the Q&A, and then I'll come back and answer that one. And then, yes, okay, so there's lots of concern over the pool water damaging your grass. So, I mean, hopefully you're not having to drain your pool that often. And if you're managing your pool appropriately, the chlorine level should not be to the point where it's going to totally kill your yard. Obviously, if you do have, you know, a garden or certain areas where you do have plants that would be very sensitive to that, if you can direct the water elsewhere, that's the recommendation. Or I don't know, talk to your neighbor if they don't care about their yard that much and see if you can put it in their yard. But again, the idea is just that it's significantly better for our local water resources to have that water have the chance to soak into the soil and be filtered that way than dumping it directly into a nearby stormwater pond or directly into the bay or a local, you know, creek or lake or the like. Okay. Can we get a PDF of the presentation? Yes, I would be happy, Bruce. I'll see if there's a way. Well, I can definitely send it to you because I see your email here. And I'll see if I might be able to send it in the follow-up email through Zoom. But either way, I'll find a way to get it to you. Let's see, way back in the beginning of the lecture when you were discussing some of the bodies of water, there were some in the Northeast that had I gotcha. Okay, so now let me. Oh, okay. So yeah, that's a good question. About you're talking about the rare coastal dune lakes, and I don't know if they would classify them as one way or the other as freshwater or saltwater. My assumption would be it would be considered freshwater, but just knowing that there is this exchange underground where during certain times, you know, that saltwater can enter the lake, and then vice versa, that freshwater can also enter the ocean. Okay, do you know where to find a map of the watershed for Hillsborough County? I can ask. I don't know offhand. I would imagine Hillsborough County does have some form of a watershed map because I know they do a lot with water resource management there. And if I do, I will include that in the follow-up email as well. Also, I do not have gutters, but I live on a lake and the water runs off into our lawn all around. Should I consider gutters? So yeah, gutters is definitely, there's a lot to consider, right? Because there's a lot of maintenance with gutters as well. If the water from your roof is already draining, you know, just you have all green space around you, then I don't really think that you have a need for gutters. But in most neighborhoods, right, that water is kind of running off into the driveway and then into a swale and into the stormwater system. So you could always consider getting like a small portion of, you know, not doing the whole system, just a small portion. You can do gutters, and you could also consider doing a rain barrel. There's all sorts of different options that you could consider. Okay, and I don't see any other questions. Oh, there's a lot going on in the chat though. Looks like, okay, Russell sent a link that might have the map of watersheds for Hillsborough County. Adopt a storm drain. Is the thought just for visible area to ensure it's clear? Yeah, so the idea with the storm drain is really just to make sure that the drain is cleared from any trash or debris. We're asking like about 10 feet all the way around the drain to ensure that it's clear, so that when it does rain, that water can flow directly into the storm drain to prevent flooding issues. And it's in the works, so definitely stay tuned for the Adopt a Drain program. Okay, and of course you guys are welcome to like do that on your own. If you have a storm drain in your yard, you don't have to wait for the Adopt a Drain program. So let's see. All right, I don't see any other questions. So again, thank you guys so much for taking time out of your day, your lunch, to learn about stormwater of all things. And please help me spread the word and check out all the opportunities that we have. And it's 1 o'clock, so I'll end right with that. Have a lovely rest of your day.